This podcast is brought to you by Innovid. Folks, we have our answer. There's been a lot of speculation about what the combination of Flash Talking and Innovid would be called. Flashavid? InnoFlash? We've got our answer at Marketecture Live, and it's Innovid. But not just any Innovid, it's a new Innovid. Innovation, intelligence, independence, the eyes have it. Check out new.innovid.com to learn more about how they're merging their ad tech stacks and shaking up the industry. That's new.innovid.com. And as ever, this ad could have been an email.
Welcome to the Monopoly Report. The Monopoly Report is dedicated to chronicling and analyzing the impact of antitrust and other regulations on the global advertising economy. Last week's newsletter focused on measurement in the ad space, and I called for a new rule for any new ad platform. If I can't independently measure and rate the efficacy of my spend, then your platform should go back to the drawing board until I can do those things. I'm encouraging our trade associations and all of you to speak up and demand this as table stakes for any new ad platform. If you are new to the Monopoly Report, you can subscribe to this weekly newsletter at monopoly-report.com, and you can check out all the Monopoly Report podcasts at monopolyreportpod.com. I'm Alan Chapell. This week, my guest is Jessica Lee, chair of the Privacy, Security, and Data Innovations practice at Loeb Loeb. Jessica works with companies across the media and advertising industries to navigate the complex regulatory environment and turn their compliance obligations into actionable business strategies. I'm excited to get Jessica's thoughts on the way the health privacy rules are being shaped in the U.S. and elsewhere. So let's get to it. Hey, Jessica. Thanks for coming on the pod. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. How are you feeling? See what I did there?
That's a whole other question. How much time do you have?
Well, that's for a separate podcast. Chapell goes deep on the psychological insights from the law profession. It'll be a hit, I'm sure. Yeah. So today we're talking about health targeting. And first, I want to align on what we mean by health targeting. You know, in the context of the ad space, there's demographic targeting, there's use of HIPAA, PHI. So, walk me through, what are the various, the most popular types of targeting in a health context?
Sure. I mean, I think all of those apply, right? Because at its foundation, it's really, targeting based on characteristics that are presumed or inferred to tie to a medical condition or to reveal a medical condition. So that can happen through demographic data. That can happen through, hopefully de-identified HIPAA data. That can happen through data collected because you visited a certain website, or attributes are collected about you over time based on your online activities. So health data can come from a number of different sources, but it's all tied to trying to reach someone. I have a drug or a treatment. I'm trying to reach my target audience. There's no point in serving that ad to someone, who doesn't need that treatment or drug.
Okay. So that makes sense. And the next thing I want to align on is sensitivity, because you had said, health treatment, health condition, there's sort of a sliding scale in my view when it comes to health data. On the lower end of the scale, you'd say, visits the gym or, uses vitamin D. But, then there's things up to flu sufferer and even cancer. And so how should the audience be thinking about sensitivity when it comes to health targeting?
Sure. And, this one is complicated. I think that the thing to keep in mind in this space generally is that the goalposts are moving frequently, right? So this is something you have to stay on top of. Historically, I think we would have looked at, the NAI code of conduct, which tried to draw a line for sensitivity with things like, cancer or sexually transmitted diseases or drugs that can't be treated with an over-the-counter medication. But in the new wave of state privacy laws, some of those definitions have broadened. So, in theory, your medical status, your medical condition could include the fact that you have the cold or a flu, for example. And I think kind of where you fit on that scale, kind of depends on where you sit, what your risk tolerance is, and, what your audience is. Because the laws, I think, are somewhat intentionally vague, and it gives companies an opportunity to make their own distinctions and draw their own lines, but be able to defend those.
Yeah, I found myself having to almost entirely rethink how I thought of sensitivity under the FTC, Because when you have the head of the FTC basically saying that, a vitamin D segment could be considered sensitive in some context, you start to go, oh my goodness. Well, that begs the question is like, where do they draw the line and what isn't sensitive in that type of context? And so that's always a bit of a challenge. And speaking of the FTC, we have a new administration in, and I'm just curious to get your sense of, Khan was using terms like surveillance capitalism. The Ferguson FTC seems less engaged on health, or at least that's my initial impression. But I'd love to hear yours.
Sure. But before I do that, if you don't mind, I'll go back just one more point on the last topic. I just wanted to note, there's a theory that basically anything could be sensitive because, if you collect enough data over time, you can generate inferences that could eventually lead to something that's sensitive. So just knowing, like you said, someone goes to the gym or has a gym membership should seem fairly innocuous, but over time that, adding additional data points to that data, you could lead to additional inferences. So I think that's where you're starting to see things go with things like vitamin D. I think that's also why it's really hard to draw the line and why my answer was it kind of depends on what you're doing internally and how your data is structured internally. So can you make an argument that you're not, making those additional inferences that could lead to health information?
That's a fantastic point. And, one of my pet peeves around how privacy is talked about is like, I don't think there's enough energy focused on the scale of a data set, the amount of data being collected. I mean, it's sort of implicit in there, but I don't know that it's really, really stated clearly. I know Europe is trying to get there with DMA and DSA, but I just think in general, it's not something that's talked about enough. And I think that's a mistake.
I agree. But, to your next question on the FTC, that's going to be interesting. I definitely think the Khan administration was very much anti-advertising. I don't think that's controversial to say. I think they were highly skeptical of advertising and the impacts of advertising. So, terms like surveillance advertising, really took off and they dug into that. I don't think that this administration has that same lens on advertising, but that doesn't mean it's completely it's a free for all, right? Because we did see the new FTC commissioner weigh in on things like precise location information. So in the mobile wallet action at the end of last year, he said precise location information, precise geolocation information is sensitive information that would require opt-in consent. And if that precise location is tied to, a health related location, I think my expectation is that he would still find that to be sensitive. So we haven't really seen him weigh in as heavily. It's also, it feels like it's been 3 years, but it's only been 3 months. So we've got to give them, a chance. But I think we also have to think about the layer of politics that will come on top of it. And to the extent that health information could impact any of the administration's initiatives, some of how they interpret health information or the sensitivity of that information might also be looked at through that lens.
That's a great point. And I think that the Ferguson FTC is probably going to focus a little bit more on harms. And for better or worse, health and precise location, or the combination of the two, much easier to draw a straight line between the use of those type of segments and a tangible harm.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but I do think, to your point, it's going to be that tangible harm. Like, is there a concrete harm, not a philosophical harm or a possible harm or, something that's a little bit down the line, but we just want to put as many guardrails in place. I don't think you're going to see that approach from, Ferguson administration.
I would agree. Okay, so the FTC is only one of the cooks in the kitchen when it comes to health. And I think you alluded to this a moment ago. The U.S. states have really stepped in to enact privacy laws which implicate health. And so walk us briefly through that, starting with, Washington, Connecticut, Nevada. California is sort of interesting because they seem to very hyper focus on the concept of inference, which is sort of interesting in a health context. But walk us through, what are the states up to?
Yeah, the states have been very busy. And I think it's important to think about the timeline on this as well, because when CCPA was passed in 2018, there actually wasn't a sensitive information definition. It was just personal information. That was added later with the CPRA. And then we saw the states after that all had some definition of sensitive information. Most of them required opt-in consent for that. But if you look at the timeline, so you have 2021, you have Virginia and Colorado, they have sensitive information definitions. And then in 2022, we have the Dobbs decision, right? And I think when the Dobbs decision comes into play, that's where you really start to see states shift. So Connecticut passed their privacy law. And then after Dobbs, they passed an amendment to that privacy law that strengthened the language around health information, specifically calling out gender affirming care and reproductive rights in the definition of what is sensitive under a health condition. All right. So you can see that somewhat in a direct response almost to the Dobbs decision, kind of putting in additional protections. And I think that informed some of the Khan administration's viewpoints on this as well. Right. And so you have, Colorado passes their law, but then they also have the right to pass regulations. And so their regulations is really where they went deep into what is sensitive information and then an inference, sensitive inferences as well. And then you see California following suit. So you see this kind of like a snowball effect that comes after 2022, which is after the Dobbs decision, where states are looking at their privacy laws to see, are there additional protections we can put in place for health information? And in many cases, specifically calling out reproductive health, to try to counter the effects of Dobbs.
So, and it's a really interesting point, Jessica. So, the overturning of Roe v. Wade created a vacuum that the states stepped into, and they stepped into it, one might argue, with the fury. And then the second thing that the overturning of Roe v. Wade did with respect to the Dobbs decision was that you now created a scenario where there's a harm argument to be made, and it's significantly more tangible.
Exactly. Right. And then, so Washington State, which for years in the kind of state privacy law world had been a state everyone had looked at, and each year they got really close to this broad comprehensive privacy law, and then it failed. But what they were able to pass was My Health, My Data Act, which was kind of the first, healthcare focused, very restrictive privacy law, focused in that space, taking a very broad approach to what can be consumer health data that's linked to a consumer's health status or treatment, anything that could be reasonably associated with the consumer's health, anything that can be used to infer health conditions. This definition is very broad. It has examples in it. But, behind the scenes, as companies are looking to interpret what that means, it goes back to what we were talking about at the top of the call. Is it flu treatment? Is it headache medication? All of that arguably falls under that law. And what's, distinctive about My Health, My Data outside of that broad consumer health definition is the fact that there's a private right of action. So, now we have the first state where it's not just regulators where you might be able to go and say, well, here's what our process was and let us try to have a conversation, or there's limited resources. Now you have a private right of action. And I think that really, scared companies about what this law can mean or what it could do.
Sure. I mean, and just from the business folks listening here, the private right of action allows class action litigants to allege violations of the law and to sue based on those violations. And so, and the funny thing about the class action bar, bless their hearts, is that they are really creative and they're really persistent. And so there's a scenario where, almost anything could be deemed health data, shoe purchaser, running enthusiast, those types of things could be health related. And I know that there's a harm requirement that they need to pass over, which makes it a little bit more comfortable for the world. But boy, I always give the example in class action suits where, they were able to convince judges consistently that a video, website is a videotape manufacturer pursuant to a 1980s law. So if you think that they can't, find a crowbar to find a loophole within a law, you might want to think again.
Exactly. And I mean, honestly, and half the battle with these, I was asked once to come speak to a business audience about, what keeps their lawyers up at night or why their lawyers ask them the questions that they ask them. And what you're talking about is exactly it. It's, the videotape law that could lead to, these lawsuits of private harm. It's a law like this where you just get a little nugget. And a lot of these cases don't go to court, but they settle, right? And they could settle for, tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes more. And the cost of litigating is so high. So that's really where you see businesses getting concerned. And I should have mentioned for Washington, one of the distinctions was, this is a consent driven law that required almost HIPAA-like authorization to get consent. So it's not a kind of cookie banner. It's not a checkbox where you could get consent for this data. It was a authorization with enough detail that I don't know any company that thought, I'm going to go and try to get consent to get health information for advertising purposes. One, because it's too hard, and two, because we don't think we're going to get it.
That's a great point. There's and kind of leads me to my next question. There's a New York law that has made its way through the legislature and is awaiting the governor's signature. And what's kind of interesting about this one is that it sort of moves beyond the consent requirement and into an outright prohibition around almost any type of sale. So, ad targeting, if it meets the definition, it would seem like would be prohibited under this law if it passed. But walk me through how, New York is thinking about that.
Sure. And New York is somewhat similar in that it has a, really broad range of what is considered, consumer health information. But it does, to your point, go beyond. And it's just consent or necessity. So you can use health information if you needed to provide the service. So you're a fitness app, right? You're a healthcare app. You might need that information, but you can only use it for that purpose. You cannot further monetize it, without getting consent. And that consent, there are a couple of hiccups around that, right? So in addition to it being complicated in the way that Washington's is, you have to wait 24 hours before you can ask someone for consent. That consent would need to be renewed once a year. That's just operational hurdles that makes it nearly impossible to do that. And then additional consent required for certain disclosures and prohibitions on sale. Right. So this is a law that is much more restrictive. And it's also broad in the sense that Washington's law applies to Washington residents. So you'll see, businesses' reaction to Washington was to exclude Washington residents from their data sets, right? That might be doable. For New York, it applies to anyone who is a New York resident or in New York State when that information is collected. So trying to track that from, an operational perspective is going to be very challenging.
And just to close the loop on the New York law, because I'm sure somebody listening to this is probably thinking, well, but if you can use it pursuant to the service being offered, ad targeting is part of the service. And so, what's your thinking on that? What is the likelihood that that's going to fly given how this law is constructed?
Yeah, that's not going to fly. I mean, if you say our service is to monetize your data in exchange for something, and that's very clear, maybe it's hard for me to think of a scenario where that's really going to fly with the Attorney General. It's really to provide the service that the consumer has requested, right? And there's unlikely that the consumer has requested targeted advertising. I know there'll be attempts to make that argument, but that's not likely to happen. I should say that bill also sits, it has not gone to the governor's desk yet, and there is a flurry of activity looking to get some chapter amendments, which means that the governor could amend that bill and make some of the provisions a little bit easier to navigate. So anyone listening to this should be talking to their internal teams about what they're doing to try to, push this bill a little bit away from where it is right now to a place that might be more manageable.
There's one other component to this law that I think is really interesting, and it's quickly becoming a trend in the states, and it's rulemaking. And so walk the audience through that, because even once the law is done, it sort of isn't done, right?
Right. And, there's pluses and minuses to this. So some laws are just laws. So you just have whatever's in the four corners of the paper of the text, and that's all you have to work from. But other states like California, for example, I mentioned Colorado earlier, and then New York, in this healthcare bill, they have the right to pass additional rules, right? So that gives additional color to what the law requires. And on the one hand, that's helpful. On the other hand, we've seen like Colorado and California add new or additional requirements into their law through the regulation process, right? So GPC, right, the requirement to respond to a browser-based opt-out signal came through rulemaking in California. You don't see GPC in the original text of the California bill. So you could see additional obligations or requirements or details that could add, more obligations on top of this law. It would give clarity, which is helpful, but it could add more obligations on top of this law as well.
Yeah. And one thing that occurs to me is that if you have more and more states that have rulemaking authority within their privacy laws, and if those states become as active as, say, California, boy, does that add potentially a whole bunch of additional complexity to things.
Exactly. Well, I mean, that's why I said the goalposts are always shifting, right? And, some of it's good and some of it's bad. You want a law to be flexible. We talked about the video privacy law from the 80s. A challenge with that is you're trying to take a law that was passed in a time where current technology doesn't exist and apply it to new technology, and it just doesn't work. And there's no rulemaking there. What California has said is what they intend to do is to, you have this law, but they plan to look across the market and see what's going on, and then issue additional rulemaking to address those changes. So as technology advances, as business advances, they can adapt their law to the current circumstances. And so there is value in doing that. I think the challenge for business is that you kind of build a program and then you have new rulemaking. And that might go against what how you originally interpreted the law or how you originally set yourself up. And now there's something new to do. So this is a journey. This is an ongoing activity. This is not, sort of deal with this law, find your solution and then move on, because it's something that's going to be continually evolving.
So we mostly talked about the U.S., and I want to shift a little bit and at least get your thoughts of how things have emerged in Europe, who are arguably health data falls under special category data, at least in some contexts. But walk us through, how you think about the EU when it comes to health targeting.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because I haven't spent as much time recently focused on that because, like you said, we have GDPR from 2018. Health information was considered as a special category data because of the combination of GDPR and the e-privacy directive. And the need to have a lawful basis for processing. There's already a restricted market for advertising in Europe. Things like race and ethnicity, even beyond health information, aren't used as widely. Health information isn't, and health targeting isn't used as widely. And that law has been on the books. Whereas in the US, you have this evolving landscape, and the US tends to approach things in a very reactive fashion, right? The video law came from confirmation of a Supreme Court judge in a reaction to what happened to when his video information was exposed. We tend to see things happen. Like you have canned spam, you have to have the unsubscribe link because email was invented and marketers were using it. We have Dobbs, so you have these health laws that are in reaction to it. So they tend to be very prescriptive and then ever changing, where, because the EU is more broad and principles based, we kind of know what the landscape is there. And obviously there's, the DMA and DSA, and we're looking at things at what it looks like to have these large data sets and how that affects the market. But on the grounds and nuts and bolts of health targeting, at least for me, the focus has really been on the US because all of that shifted, and what was possible before has become much harder to do.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. And there's some of that when you get into, this is a little off topic, but when you get into things like race and ethnicity, there is sort of a long history of using those types of segments in a very benign way in the US. And it's been a huge adjustment for the business community. And one would argue that there's certainly at best a mixed bag around identifying those as sensitive.
I agree. Yeah. We could have a whole other conversation on that. I mean, the challenge with all of this is, there are nefarious uses for lots of, even innocuous data. There are nefarious uses, right? And so you're trying to protect people by, creating these categories of sensitive information and putting race and ethnicity and putting health in there. But there are also good uses for those categories of data as well. And that's, I think, the tension that the US is grappling with right now.
Yeah, I would agree. So one of the claims that I often hear from health targeting vendors is that their data set is HIPAA compliant, or they're using HIPAA de-identified data sets. And, walk us through, obviously you're not inside anybody's brain, but what's your sense of what they mean when they say those things?
Sure. So, HIPAA, you have two types of data. You have HIPAA covered data, and if data is covered by HIPAA, it's because it was created or generated in the healthcare context by a covered entity, like a hospital or a physician or an insurance company, right? And all that data kind of flows down from there. And so what could be valuable is getting, health claims data, for example, or other sorts of definitive or determinative healthcare information. That data is PHI covered under HIPAA unless you de-identify it. And HIPAA has two standards. So you can either de-identify it by stripping out up to 18 identifiers that you need to strip out in order to call that data de-identified, or you can get a HIPAA expert determination, which basically means you get a statistician to come in and look at your data set and say there's a very low probability that you would be able to re-identify anyone in this data set, that you would be able to tie any one individual to a specific condition in that data set. And so what you see a lot of companies doing is not looking at the safe harbor, which strips the identifiers out, because you would have to take out identifiers that would be helpful for targeting purposes, but looking at expert determination, having experts come in and say, based on the size of this data set and how it's composed, we can call it de-identified.
Okay, so that's a fantastic explanation, and I appreciate that. But one of the things, so we say that HIPAA brings this concept of de-identification to the table. And the idea, you remove identifiability from the data set, take shape so that it remains in that state, and it becomes, more privacy safe and allows one to remove the data set effectively from the privacy rule set, which is all great. We've got 30 years of precedent or history on de-identification, and then the U.S. states come along with very broad definitions of personal data and then broad interpretations of what an inference means, and then some I would characterize as rather odd definitions of what de-identified data in that means in that context. And so, what does that do to the ad targeting community's ability to really pull a data set out of the privacy rules?
Yeah. And I mean, I would say you can't pull the data set out of the privacy rules, right? I would caution companies from thinking that there's some like magic button and now it's HIPAA expert determination has been applied. And so now the privacy rules don't apply. And because I think these two things have to work together. So if you look at the state definitions for what's de-identified data, it's data that's been, de-identified, meaning it's been stripped of any, direct identifiers in a way that'd be hard to tie that person back to a specific person back to a piece of data. But it doesn't stop there. You also have to make public statements that you will not re-identify that data. You have to also not actually try to re-identify that data and pass those obligations down to your partners. I think that becomes complicated because you take a de-identified HIPAA data set on the front end, you use that to create an audience. But at the end of the day, in order to reach that audience, you have to attach identifiers to that data. And that's, I think, where the rub comes in. I think the argument is even when you attach those identifiers, it's still de-identified because you don't know who in that data set has a condition. There's either enough, there's enough noise or the size of the data set's so big that, yes, there's some probability that someone in this data set has a condition, but you don't know who that is, even once you attach those identifiers. But then the last step is you have to look in the back end. So once someone engages with that ad, do you make an inference about that? So maybe you didn't know who's in the data set in the front end, but once you collect all of that, all the click-through data, all the data that you collect from measuring the effectiveness of that ad, if you're generating inferences from that, so now being added to an audience, again, that's potentially where you see health information being created under the state laws because of the broad definitions of health information that do extend to inferences. So you kind of have to look at the full life cycle of how that audience is created and what information is taken from that audience to try to make an argument that, you don't have health information somewhere in that journey.
Right. But let me put you a little bit on the spot here. Once you have a targeting category assigned to a pseudonymous UID, isn't at the very least that some form of an inference?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's where you have to, companies will look at things like, okay, is it demographic data, for example, because then you make an argument, even if you are trying to target a specific drug or targeting based on demographics. If you're using actual health information, how are we labeling that segment? Can we label that segment in a way that strips out the, health related information that's hard to do because you need to know who you're reaching. So it has to be descriptive. But yes, I think this is where the balancing act comes in and it becomes, I think a risk-based decision. You can put governance controls in place with things like labeling and, segment naming and that kind of thing. But if you're in a segment of diabetes patients, I think you can, there are inferences to be made there and regulators aren't going to look at that as anything but health information, depending on what state you're in and how they've defined those terms.
No, that makes sense. What 2 or 3 insights would you want the audience here to take away when it comes to health targeting in a way that is defensible and we'll just say privacy safe?
Sure. Well, I'll go back to what I said before. I would say look at the whole data lifecycle. I do believe it's possible to create, audience segments that do either use, demographic data, use, HIPAA expert determination, use a combination of factors to say, or privacy enhancing technologies. We've created this segment of consumers where there's some probability, but no determinative data that someone has a particular condition. But I think you need to also kind of go, like I said, through the rest of the life cycle and make sure that inferences aren't being generated on the back end, that there are appropriate controls in place, that you have the right segment naming conventions in place. Again, the big picture for this is that regulators are concerned about the harm of being placed in a segment that reveals your health condition, what that could potentially do for you. So what controls can you put in place to try to get ahead of that harm? And then could that information then be used for other nefarious purposes? Do you get denied, insurance, for example? Do insurance decisions get made based on that data? So I think it's important to first take a step back and understand what the harms are that the regulators are trying to get at, and then zoom into what you're doing specifically and see how you can make an argument about how you've tried to defend or protect against those harms. That way, no one's going to be perfect, but I think it's important to be able to tell a good story about the controls that you put in place. And then, I would say leverage privacy enhancing technologies. I do think there's an argument there that can be made. Again, going back to how have you created this segment? Have you introduced enough noise? I don't think it's enough to just say you've hashed, IDs and then we're protected. You have to go a layer deeper than that. So I would say, again, lean into privacy enhancing technologies, and then track the space, because it is a moving goalpost, and make sure you're kind of marching with the crowd, not getting too far ahead of it.
It's funny. I remember when Commissioner Leibowitz, so I'm going back a bit here, made a huge deal around the use of interest-based advertising data for things like insurance, underwriting, and most of the business community and even a lot of the privacy community said, come on, that's not happening. And it was true at the time. I think that was very rare. But we now see, even, in the case of connected cars, and that's a little different, but not that far afield here. You're starting to see that type of information, that it does make its way into the insurance game. And that's, I think, where the huge tangible harm comes from.
Yeah, insurance, government access to that data, and what could happen if the government gets access to that data, again, depending on what state you're in and what those interests are. So I think it used to be, we're just selling, we're selling shoes, we're selling purses. But, what we're talking about, health information, I think there are some significant harms that need to be addressed.
Yeah, I would agree. This has been a fantastic conversation, Jessica. I really appreciate you coming on. And I just have one more question for you. Share what your hobby or passion is. I always like to humanize. There's a lot of really smart people coming on this show. And I like to just give the audience something like just, what's the Jessica behind the Jessica?
I feel like I need a new answer because I talk about this a lot, but I do run. I run a lot. I run marathons. So I ran the Tokyo Marathon last year, which was an amazing experience. And I have a couple of marathons, including the Berlin Marathon coming up this year. So travel and running, I think, would be two passions I could put on that list.
Those are great ones. So I did one marathon. I did the 2001 New York City Marathon. And it was one of the most fantastic experiences of my entire life. And there is no chance in the world that I'm ever going to do another one. So kudos to you. You've done a bunch of them, it sounds like.
I've done 8. At the end of this year, hopefully it'll be 10. I did New York 3 times. And after the first New York, I said, I'm never doing this again. That was a lot of fun. And then I signed up for the one the next year. So it got me. I don't know how, but it did.
But we've talked a bit on this podcast that running is a fantastic way of grounding yourself in the same way that yoga is. And so like that's a gift that you're able to give to yourself. And so just fantastic. I still run, but it's in the 3 or 4 mile at most variety. But even that, boy, is just wonderful.
Yeah, a much more humane distance, I would say.
Jessica Lee, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
That was fun. I'm glad to have had the chance to chat with Jessica. We've got a bunch of other fantastic guests coming up on the Monopoly Report podcast over the next few weeks. Please subscribe to the show at monopolyreportpod.com or on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to the Marketecture Podcast. New episodes come out every Friday, and an insightful vendor interview is published each Monday. You can subscribe to our library of hundreds of executive interviews at marketecture.tv. You can also sign up for free for our weekly newsletter with my original strategic insights on the week's news at news.marketecture.tv. And if you're feeling social, we operate a vibrant Slack community that you can apply to join at adtechgod.com.